Good day, everyone. Welcome to our Term 3, our Work for Life Sciences Grade 11. And now we're going to be looking at gaseous exchange. So what I'll do right now, I'm going to share a screen with you. And then from there, we're going to start discussing it. So when it comes now to gaseous exchange, there are different terminologies that you're going to come across, and it is very important for each and every one of you to actually understand these terms before they can even start with aerobic respiration or before they can even start with the gaseous exchange. So the first term there that we have is called aerobic respiration. So when it comes to aerobic respiration, we've heard it before from grade 10, now we're current on to grade 11. So we have said aerobic respiration is the type of respiration that occurs in the presence of oxygen, which simply means that if you're looking at human beings are basically an example of aerobic respiration because when it comes to the breathing, which is the intake of oxygen and outtake of carbon dioxide, you're always going to have what? Oxygen being present. That's why we're simply saying aerobic respiration is the type of respiration that occurs in the presence of oxygen. Then another term that we have there is called anaerobic respiration. So when it comes to the anaerobic respiration, this is the type of respiration that occurs in the absence of oxygen. So if we're looking at anaerobic respiration, we're looking at some of the microorganisms. For microorganisms, in order for them to ferment, they don't really need the presence of oxygen. You can look at bacteria. Bacteria undergoes anaerobic respiration because in order for it to be able to ferment, in order for it to be able to multiply, it does not need oxygen to do so. And then another term that we're also going to come across is the aquatic. We've already done it in grade 10, we know it from grade 8, we know it from grade 9 natural sciences. So when it comes to the aquatic, these are the plants or these are the organisms or plants and animals, if we put it like that, that actually live in water. They are said to be aquatic. And then we have terrestrial. These are the plants that actually live on land or on land. So basically, that is the difference between aquatic and terrestrial. Aquatic has to do with water, therefore, the organisms will be staying in water or they'll live in water. Terrestrial, this is when the organisms are going to be living in water, on land. And then we have a carbohydrate. Again, carbohydrate, I believe we're all familiar. If you've forgotten, I'm still going to remind you. So when it comes to the carbohydrates, basically these are the organic compounds that include your glucose, that include your sucrose, and that is also going to include your starch. So just a recap, if we're talking about glucose, sucrose, and starch, you're going to realize that we've actually covered three different types of sugars. If I can take you back, you'll remember that in grade 10, we did say that there are certain sugars that can be broken down into simpler states, and we also have got sugars that cannot be broken down into simpler compounds, if I may put it like that. So when it comes to your glucose is an example of a monosaccharide, and we did say that a monosaccharide is when we have one type of sugar that can never be broken down. And then you have your second type of sugar, which is known as a disaccharide. So when it comes to the disaccharide, you're looking at your sucrose. Your sucrose is basically made up of two sugars that are combined together. Therefore, when you're looking at your sucrose, we say it is a disaccharide, simple meaning you've got two sugars that have been joined together. And then we look at your starch. So when it comes to the starch, it is a result of polysaccharides, which simply means many sugars have been brought together. So this is what we're talking about if we're speaking about carbohydrates. So carbohydrates are looking at your organic compounds that can include your glucose, that can include your starch, and that can also include your sucrose. They all fall under the what? The carbohydrates. And then our next term that we have there is called diffusion. So diffusion is the movement of molecules from a higher concentration to a lower concentration until equilibrium is reached. Or you can simply say diffusion is the movement of molecules from a region of higher concentration to a region of lower concentration until equilibrium has been reached. Then the last term that we have there is called glucose. So when it comes to glucose, we normally define it as a source of energy. So when it comes to glucose, we'll remember we have covered it prior. We said glucose is going to be converted into glycogen, which is now going to be stored in liver and muscles, and then it is going to be converted back into glucose if energy is required, or if anyone requires more sugar levels in their body. So that is the definition of glucose. So we're going to move on to our next slide, which is breathing, right? So remember we said here we're looking at gaseous exchange, and gaseous exchange has to do with that, with breathing. So when it comes to the organisms, right, breathing is basically the mechanical process of inhalation and exhalation. So someone might be asking themselves, what is inhalation or what is exhalation? So inhalation is the intake of oxygen, and exhalation is the outtake of carbon dioxide. So when we're looking at breathing, it is also known as ventilation, which is a process of intake of oxygen and the outtake of carbon dioxide to or from outside the body. So what happens is that when it comes to the breathing, all the living organisms, they actually require oxygen in order for them to sustain their life. So what's going to happen is that the oxygen, or the same oxygen that we require to sustain our life, it is the one that is going to be used to release energy from the carbohydrates that are found in all our bodily cells. So the reason why the oxygen is going to be used to release energy, it is because for each and every organisms to continue surviving, or for it to actually live in a normal way, or for it to be able to survive, it actually requires energy. Which simply means that if an organism that does not have adequate amount of energy that it requires, it cannot be able to sustain its life. That's why you're always going to need oxygen to be present, and that is why you're also going to need the same oxygen converting or releasing the energy that is found from the carbohydrates in your cells to different parts of the body, so that each and every organ in your body can actually have energy. So when it comes to the breathing, we are going to know that, or we're going to take note that when it comes to some organisms which are said to be complex organism, and a complex organism actually involves us as human beings. So human beings are said to be complex organisms because they've got a mechanism that they actually use for breathing, right? So that mechanism that we use for breathing, it is the same mechanism that we use to intake or to breathe in oxygen. So if you're looking at us as human beings, we're going to have your mouth, they're going to have your nostrils. All those, you look at your diaphragm, you look at your alveoli, you look at your lungs, all those, they work together, and they're known as a breathing mechanism that actually helps us as human beings to take in oxygen. I believe everyone is still understanding what breathing is. So one thing about this lesson is that it's going to be broken down into part one, part two, so that you can get to understand it bit by bit instead of us all doing it all at once. So when it comes to the mechanism for breathing, as human beings, I've presented a diagram one and diagram two. So basically both diagrams actually show us how human beings use their mechanism for breathing in order for them to inhale, and in order for them to also exhale. So what happens is that when it comes to human beings, right, one thing that we're going to do is that we actually take in, or we actually breathe in oxygen through two different ways, right? We can either breathe in oxygen, or we can either take in oxygen using the mouth cavity, or we can actually use the nasal cavity. So when it comes to the nasal cavity, one thing about nasal cavity is that it is made up of what is known as your ciliated epithelium columnar. right? So when it comes to the ciliated epithelium columnar, this is a type of tissue that we've previously covered, obviously. So when it comes to the ciliated epithelium, one thing that you are going to remember is that we did say that the ciliated columnar actually consists of cilia. So, for someone who does not know, when it comes to the ciliated epithelium columnar, the cilia are the tiny hairs that you are going to find in your nasal cavity. So, still, whilst you still have got to what your ciliated epithelium columnar, one of the other things that you're going to have is that ciliated epithelium columnar, it consists of the goblet cells. So the goblet cells, they consist of mucus. So one thing that is going to happen is that your mucus, together with your goblets, together with your cilia, which is from the ciliated columnar, and your goblet is from where? Is from the ciliated columnar, but it also consists of the what? Of the mucus. So your cilia and your mucus, they are going to work together to make sure that they trap the dust, right? So which simple means that your nasal cavity has also the capability of not only receiving oxygen, but it can also get affected by the dust particles. So remember, when it comes to the dust particles, once they enter your what? Your nose, immediately you are going to find out that your mucus is going to be activated, and then from there at times you get sort of a fluish like up so that it can remove all the dust that has been trapped inside the what? Inside the nasal cavity. And also at the same time, as much as your mucus is used to actually trap dust and remove all the foreign particles that will have entered your cavity, right? It doesn't stop there. When it comes to your mucus now, it's also going to be responsible for making sure that your nasal does not get dry. But it is also there to make sure that it keeps our nasal moisturized. So, as much as our nasal is going to be moisturized, we also need warmth inside the nasal. So, when it comes to the warmth that you always feel, because if ever we have felt our nasal cavity, we can all witness or we can all attest that they are actually warm. So what makes it to be warm? Whenever you touch or whenever you feel it, I don't know what you have done before to feel that it's actually warm, you can do a practice now and you can tell if it's warm or not. So what makes it or what keeps it warm every now and then, it is because of the blood capillaries that you find in your nose. So when it comes to those blood capillaries, they are actually there to keep your nasal cavity warm. So once you have received or once you have taken in or once you have breathed in oxygen, it is going to move down to your larynx. So when it comes to your larynx, it actually consists of a voice box. So what happens is that when oxygen passes above your larynx, which is your voice box, a sound is going to be made. So what simple means that if there's absence of oxygen, there's no sound that can actually be made. That's why we need that particular oxygen to pass through over our larynx, which is your voice box, and then a sound can be made. So when it comes to your larynx, you are going to find out that just above your larynx, you are going to have what is called an epiglottis. So when it comes to an epiglottis, it is that cartilage layer. I think if we can open your mouth wide, you're going to see that there is a layer or there's something which looks like a pea of some sort, which is hanging at the end of your mouth. That is called your epiglottis. It is not shown in this particular diagram, but when it comes to your epiglottis, it is actually responsible for opening and closing, especially when you are eating. So if you're not eating anything, your epiglottis is just going to remain open so that you can still have an intake of oxygen. But what happens is that if ever you have to swallow anything, right, your epiglottis is going to close. Why is it closing? It is to prevent choking. So what can cause choking is that if your epiglottis is open, it simply means that your food is going to use a wrong windpipe, and then from there you're going to start choking. That's why every time you swallow, your epiglottis is always going to close. And then moving right along, your oxygen is now going to be transported to the trachea. So if you're looking at your trachea, one thing that you can attest to is that your trachea is actually made up of ring cartilage. So I don't know if you can see my mouse over there, but on that particular point, we can actually see that when it comes to our trachea, they are actually made up of what? Of ring-like cartilage. So when it comes to your trachea, it is situated in front of the what? In front of the esophagus. So when it comes now to your trachea, one thing about your trachea is that it branches out into your left bronchi, and it also branches out into your right bronchi. So when it comes to your left and when it comes to your right bronchi, these ones are actually used when it comes to what? To breathing in, or when it comes to the breathing out. They basically help the lungs not to collapse, especially when you are breathing. So what happens is that when it comes now to a trachea, one of the reasons why it is actually ring shaped, it is to allow oxygen to pass through without it being inhibited in any way. That is why if you're looking at your trachea, it is made up of those elastic rings, and those rings are actually opened so that there is no oxygen that is going to be inhibited, or so that there's no inhibition of the what? Of the flow of oxygen. So one thing that you can also see is that um, when it comes to this trachea, it allows air to move from the lungs to the outside part, which is your carbon dioxide, or it also allows your oxygen to actually pass through. And then we have what are called the bronchi, right? So like we have already seen that when it comes to our trachea, it is going to what? It is going to divide into left bronchi, and it's also going to be divided into right bronchi. So when it now comes to the bronchi, one thing about them is that they are going to form tiny particles which are known as your alveoli, right? So when it comes to these alveoli, they actually allow your gaseous exchange to occur. So here we have an alveoli. I've written note about alveoli. So we're saying a bronchial end in a collection of alveoli. Like we have already said that your trachea is going to split into two, where it's going to form the left bronchi and also going to form the right bronchi. So another thing that I missed to mention is that when it comes to the bronchi, it has got the same activity as your nasal cavity, whereby they're both going to consist of mucus. So when it comes to the mucus that is going to be received by the what? Um, or the mucus that is going to be lining up your bronchi, is that it makes sure, or it keeps the air that is taken in moisturized, which simply means that as human beings, we are not supposed to be breathing in dry air. So in order for us not to breathe in that dry air, your bronchi is going to be lined up with your what? With your mucus, so that it can remain moisturized. And then we have our alveoli. So like we're already seeing that when it comes to the alveoli, it is going to end up in a collection of what? Of the bronchial, sorry, is going to end in a collection of the alveoli, which is a site for gaseous exchange. So what happens is that when it comes to your alveoli, they are going to increase the surface area. So that is one thing that you actually have to know about your what? About your bronchi and about your alveoli. So what happens is that when it comes to the alveoli, right, it also has got a thin wall, which is known as your squamous epithelium cells. So what happens is that when it comes to the squamous epithelium cells, we have done it previously. One of the places where you can find the squamous epithelium cell, we did say that you can find it in your mouth or you can find it in your vagina in grade 10. So when it now comes to the squamous epithelium cells, we find it again in the alveoli. Reason being, when it comes to the squamous epithelium cells, right, these are the tissue fluid that actually keeps the wall of the alveoli moisturized for easy dissolving gases. So what happens is that when we're looking at the alveoli, you're going to find out that the alveoli is going to be covered or is going to be surrounded by large capillaries. So when it comes to those capillaries, they are the ones that are going to allow the rapid diffusion of the gases between the alveoli and the blood. So the alveoli can release its gases, but in order for them to be able to diffuse to the blood, you actually need it to be filled up with what? With those large capillaries. And then what happens is that when it also comes to the alveoli, the way they are, or the way they appear, or the way they actually made, right, is that there are supposed to be many alveoles, which simple means once your bronchi branches out into forming what your alveoli, you are supposed to have many alveoles being formed, because once you've got many alveoles being formed, it simply means that you also have to increase, or you're going to increase the surface area so that there's adequate amount of gaseous exchange. So another thing that we heard in our diagram, we actually had what we called the larynx, right? And we also had what is called the pharynx. So when it comes to the pharynx, you find it in the thoracic region or in the throat region. So this one is basically responsible for connecting your nasal to your larynx. So it's basically connect your nasal with your larynx, and it is the one that actually allows the entrance of the gases, or the entrance of gases, yeah, basically the entrance of the gases into the trachea and the esophagus. So which simple means if we did not have a pharynx, that simple means the gases were not going to pass from the pharynx, they were not going to be able to reach the trachea, nor were they going to be able to reach the esophagus, which is the importance of the what? Of the pharynx. And we did say that the pharynx, we're going to find it where? Let me try and show you the diagram. So we said when it comes to the pharynx, we actually find it where? We actually find it in just above your larynx, right? Just below your nasal cavity. So that is the reason for the pharynx. And then when it comes to the larynx, we did say that the larynx consists of the what? Of the vocal cords. And then from there we said the air has to pass over these cords so that a sound is produced. So when it comes to it now, we are going to see that it's now going to go to your what? After it passes your bronchi, you are now going to have your lungs, which are shown in the diagram there. So when it comes to the lungs, basically defining lungs, basically see these are two spongy elastic lungs, right? Or the two spongy parts that we find, and they're known as the lungs, and they're surrounded by what is called a double pleural membrane. So if you're looking at a double pleural membrane, you can look into diagram number 2. So our diagram number 2 does show us the double pleural membrane. So what happens is that the organ, which is your lung, right? The lung is going to receive oxygen from the air so that it can be sent throughout the body. So what happens is that when it comes to the lungs, they are going to receive what? Oxygen. And once they receive oxygen, it is the duty of the lungs to make sure that all the oxygen that has been received, it is going to be sent throughout the body. And also at the same time, the body cells, when they receive oxygen from the lungs, they're also going to release carbon dioxide. So when it now comes to your lungs, it is also going to receive the what? The carbon dioxide from the body cells, and it is the responsibility of the lungs now again to actually expel them to the outside body. So when it now comes to this pleural membrane, like we said, the pleural membrane also consists of what is called a pleural fluid. So when it comes to the pleural fluid, it's going to act as a lubrication, if I may put it like that. It is going to act as a lubricant so that it can help reduce friction during the inhalation and exhalation. So that is the function of the what? Of the pleural fluid. So where do you find the pleural fluid? You find it in the pleural membrane or in the pleural cavity. So when we meet again, we are now going to be continuing with the muscles that are responsible, or with the muscles that are involved with breathing, whereby we are going to look at the process of inhalation, and we're also going to look at the process of exhalation. I believe you all understood. You can save this video, you can go through it over and over so that it can actually build up for the topic for the gaseous exchange. So our lesson for today ends here. And thank you so much for watching, and thank you so much for tuning through.